Okay, well, hi Darren. So thanks for making
How you
time
doing,
today.
Rob? And you're
I'll
welcome. Pleasure to be here.
yeah, thank you. It's great to talk, I guess, kind of sort of across the country. So as Janice mentioned, I'm Rob Santos. The Manitoba School Boards Association has invited me to help facilitate conversations with the community about the very important topic of representation on school boards. And so over the next 30 minutes, we'd really love to draw on your experience and expertise as an educational leader, including if the spirit moves you, your perspectives on indigenization and reconciliation. You're really interested in hearing your thoughts and advice about, I guess, the multi-level influences, sort of from the macro of society and educational systems, all the way zooming into the micro level of the classroom that our kids, that the students are in. Um, so if we could start with looking at this, and of course your audience are all the school trustees, all the members of each of the school boards in all the school divisions and districts of the province of Manitoba. And as Janice mentioned, we'll be making available these conversations, both in excerpted form for their meeting on November 21st, as well as in full form, because it's maybe of interest to others to hear the full uncensored, unedited discussion that we might have over the next half hour. And that way you're likely to reach a much broader audience, including probably different members of the EdCan network and all of our educational partners across the country. So to start with, if you sort of think first at that societal, that big picture level, the education system level, in your experience, what do you feel is the single largest barrier to individuals from marginalized communities being represented in school divisions in different jurisdictions?
I think the single biggest barrier is simply history. We have a history in this country of exclusion, and people have grown up within the context of their learned histories. And so, it becomes very easy for people to not see when people are excluded. So I spent 16 years on the school board here in Nova Scotia, and no, I'm sorry, not 16. I spent 10 years on the school board here in Nova Scotia. And I knew from the moment that I stepped on the school board that nobody was going to be able to exclude me. But I think that it's always a challenge for First Nations people across this country to make their voices heard in the dominant society. And without a doubt, school boards are the dominant society.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and so building on that, as you reflect on that decade of experience and your own observations and I guess conversations with other colleagues, I know an issue that's often come up in our experience and in others is what you're talking about, which is given the historical exclusion of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, other communities, cultural groups, and nations. Um, there sometimes has been I guess, a tendency, if not a risk, to possibly overgeneralize as well. And so, where there is new opportunities for those voices to be heard, a challenge that sometimes comes up is really what I think you're talking about, which is, well, who can or should speak for whom? And can you say a bit more about that in terms of the challenges and opportunities of individuals being called on as members of school boards or advisors to school boards to represent much larger, possibly quite diverse groups in their own right?
Well, I'll give you a little bit of experience, my experience here in Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia, we had since 2000 and since 1997, we have had appointed school board members. So, as a First Nations Mi'kmaq individual, I was not elected to this position. I was chosen by the chiefs of three of the communities within the catchment area of the Cape Breton-Victoria Regional School Board, and it reflected the nation-to-nation relationship that existed between the Mi'kmaq and the provincial government here. So I think that set the stage for us in our own First Nations community to ask ourselves some fundamental questions, such as who do we want to represent us? What experiences should they have? and how can they best advocate, and how can we communicate with them when we need advocacy at the school board level. And so in my day job outside of this, I'm the director of education for one community called Member Two. We are extremely successful. We have over a 90% high school success rate over the last 10 years. And so I have a lot of things to draw upon. I'm also an educator. I'm trained as a high school math teacher. So there was a perspective that came with me to the school board, and I'm also an individual who is not afraid to speak up. And so I think that those are things that we have to look for when we're asked to have people represent us at the school board levels in the provincial circles. Uh, I think it's important that we have the right individuals, people with the knowledge, the background, the skill set to communicate. All of those things are extremely important.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, let's continue with this. This is so important, I think, for our context as well, and the diversity of communities in Manitoba. So, given what you just identified, which is a very important structural difference in the school boards compared to here, which are through electoral processes, but similar levels of importance in all those dimensions and qualities that you just mentioned. Um, could you say more or offer some advice for those in those positions now, as well as I think where you were also speaking to the future possibilities as well. So the audience on the 21st will be current elected school trustees from all different perspectives and different communities in Manitoba, who may have varying levels of all those qualities you just spoke about. Are there success stories or examples or learning opportunities or just ideas that you'd offer to help them build their own capabilities and capacities in those areas you talked about, including being able to really give that perspective and express your voice?
Yeah, I think that one of the most important things about having a voice is knowing how to use it and knowing where to get the information so that you can be an effective voice. One of the things that we did here in Nova Scotia when I was on the school board was have regular contact with the chiefs of those three communities. So whenever there was an issue that was affecting any of them, either my home community of Member Two or our sister communities of Wagmatcook or Eskazoni, we're able to have that open dialogue with that community. So when they had a concern, they knew they could simply pick up the phone, call me, and I would be able to voice that concern at the school board level. Uh, I think it was important to also remember as an Aboriginal trustee, as a Mi'kmaq trustee, it was really important to remember that I'm not there only to provide a perspective that is Mi'kmaq. I'm also there as a full-fledged school board member and at large as well. And so I know during the times when we talked about budget and when we talked about school composition and we talked about what our need schools, especially around the fiscal discussions that we were having, because allocating those resources directly affects all of those students, and all of those students include our students as First Nations. So I think that having that and understanding that is really important. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that when you're on the school board as an Aboriginal voice or as a First Nations voice, it's important that you understand your own community, that you have connections into it, that you have the ability to go and speak to your elders and your leadership in those communities so that they can provide you with a direction. You're going out there, you're not going out there as yourself. You're not going out there as, I'm not going out and representing the Mi'kmaq as Darren Googoo. I'm going out there representing the Mi'kmaq nation from the perspective of our community, our elders, our chiefs, and our political, our politicians as well. So, and
Yes.
our parents.
Yeah, exactly. And it strikes me listening to you that as with that greater sense of responsibility, as you just described it, all the more important all the more important those relationships that you just described to establish and nurture to enable representation to be as informed and as representative as possible. Um, so can you go a bit, zoom in a little bit to that governance and leadership level of the school boards, and in light of or noting, I guess, the advantages that you just described of an appointment process to become a school trustee, given that trustees in Manitoba, for example, are elected, which has its own advantages and challenges as well, including being able to engage and invite candidates to run in the electoral process and then get elected into those offices. As I think you're aware, don't often or always lead to the kind of focused, almost intentional identification through an appointment process. So thinking of what most elections are like, I mean, I guess our neighbors down south were just through a major one with the president. But I certainly have gotten the impression from other of these conversations that democracy, that elected office, the representation for our children's education is no less important, even in smaller districts or divisions. So are you aware, either from other sister provinces or territories or other fellow school divisions or districts that do engage in an election process for trustees, have there been any successful mechanisms when a school board finds itself to be not as diverse or as representative as it would like, but still desires to engage and express and enact the voices of that broader community?
Yeah, well, school boards were eliminated here in 2018. However, at that time, there were two unique members of our school boards. There were 8 school boards in Nova Scotia, and each one of those school boards had an Aboriginal trustee or a Mi'kmaq trustee, and each one of them had an African Nova Scotian trustee. They both used a very different process to select individuals. The Mi'kmaq, by way of the nation-to-nation relationship that existed here prior to contact, and has evolved so that the nation-to-nation relationship is between the province and the Mi'kmaq. The way of honoring that process was to have the school board members be appointed. That didn't mean that we didn't have a democratic process. It's just a different type of democratic process. But I think it's important to remember that when I'm appointed, I go through a different process. My appointment has to pass through 3 chiefs and councils, and the chiefs of those communities have to agree in a consensus basis, that I will be their representative. In the case of our Mi'kmaq representative here in Nova Scotia, it was by reaching out to the local communities, the local First Nations communities that were under the catchment area, and they as a community had to go through their process, whatever it may be, and democratically choose someone to be their representative on the council or on the school board. And for the African Nova Scotian community, they had a process set up so that the electorate, those people in the Black community, had an opportunity to vote for someone who they felt represented their needs. So if you were a African Nova Scotian, or if you were a parent of an African Nova Scotian, or if you were a grandparent of an African Nova Scotian in the public school system, you were able to vote in that election for that individual. So, if you have a true desire to be diverse and representative, you have to be willing to look outside the box and say, how can we best find a way forward, a mechanism to ensure that voice, which we deemed important, is at the table with us all of the time.
Yes, exactly. So keeping on that, and with your so important observation about the impact and power of history and across generations, maybe turning our attention a little bit to the students in terms of their own futures, and what role or ideas or advice would you have in the matter of educational leadership or divisional participation, or just supporting students in their own future journeys, possibly as growing adults, in terms of increasing and diversifying equity and representation in school divisions?
Well, just like school boards that haven't traditionally been represented, we haven't seen ourselves reflected in school boards through a historical lens. Children often go to school and they don't see themselves reflected in the corridors of that school. They don't see First Nations teachers, they don't see First Nations principals, vice principals, they don't see custodians, they don't see support staff in those schools that look like them. And that's really important, that I think that schools are reflective of the community that they draw from. So in our case, in our community in Membertou, I've often said that for First Nation students right across this country, for years and years, when a student graduated from high school, and it was at one point, our success rates at high school graduation were abysmal. They were in the 20-25%. But before I came to work in my community, in the 7 years preceding my position as a director of education here in my community, those 7 years collectively, we had a 26% high school graduation rate.
Wow.
And so what we would often say in First Nations communities, when someone graduates, we think they're exceptional because they've gone through a system, and they oftentimes are. The ones that graduated in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they had to be exceptional in order to meet that minimum requirement for graduation. Yeah. And so the challenge for school boards today is to be able to look in a mirror and say to themselves, what can I as a school board trustee, what can I as a school board institution do that allows students to meet those requirements for graduation? How can we create a playing field where First Nation students are no longer need to be exceptional to walk across that stage after 13 years? I always say that the single biggest thing that we need to do is we need to create an educational system where a First Nations high school graduate, a First Nations high school graduate is not an exception,
Yes,
but in fact is an expectation.
yes, yes. Yeah, amazing. And visionary. And if I could ask too, because what you describe in terms of transforming schools and the school system to better reflect literally and figuratively the kids, the families, the communities that they serve. And you've been in this field a long enough time to have seen the variations over time in terms of things like hiring policies from a leadership or a governance or even in a school setting. So what's your current thinking on things like what used to be called affirmative action or employment equity, finding that balance of the best talent in the classroom to educate our children while also ensuring all of those tangible and intangible qualities that matter just as much in educating children are also reflected?
I think that those types of programs are so important in the First Nations school system. They are so important, I mean, for First Nations students in the provincial school system. And the reason I say that is because we are not set up. We don't often have the time to aspire to be teachers in a provincial system. There are very few of us in our communities who aspire to work outside of our communities. So in order to meet that challenge, we need to create an opportunity within those organizations, within those schools, within those institutions. I think it's so important that we understand that we need to be intentional in our actions. And when I talk about intentionality, it's so important. I'm talking with my hands. I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
But the intentionality that that needs to be there for school boards. If you want diversity around your staff, you need to be intentional about it. You need to say, if we want to have a 6% of our staff reflect the 6% of their First Nation students, or the 30%, or the 40%, we need to be intentional about that. And we need to say, we need to hire 14 First Nations teachers this year. We need to be very intentional, and we need to set out with that goal in mind. And our process has to, at the end of the day, our process has to deliver 14 First Nation students if that's the intention.
Yes.
Otherwise, we're just spinning our heels, and we're just going to create a situation where we're making excuses year after year after year about why First Nations are not participants in the school system, the public school system.
Yeah, both from an inertia perspective, but also perpetuating those earlier patterns that you mentioned. So can you continue that advice and those thoughts to, let's say, and there are some of these more, let's say, culturally homogeneous communities where there's maybe less diversity or less or next to no indigenous membership from a population level. But from just knowing your work and how important this is really for all communities of whatever makeup and composition, what kinds of things would you suggest or advise to those communities that are less diverse in their population makeup, but still value and want to learn more and reflect more in their work, as well as possibly in their staffing makeup and in their leadership level, exactly those same dimensions and qualities that you talked about from for the other communities where there's greater Indigenous participation and membership in the community?
Well, my experience has been not just in Nova Scotia, but I've traveled across this entire country over the last 25 years in my role as director here. Um, I have yet to see uh, provincial school systems that are truly reflective of the community that they serve. You know, they can say we don't have a large population, but when you go and you actually look at the numbers in those schools of First Nations employees, teachers, principals, vice principals, our school boards hire and they work with and hire tens of thousands of teachers, tens of thousands of custodians. You know, most hundreds to thousands of administrative people. They have, you know, some of them have hundreds of people working in their central office. And if they have a community, they say, well, we'll only have a 2% of our community is First Nations or 10%. When you look in their school systems, they still do not reflect that. They do not even reflect the bare minimum. So I think that those are the systems where they need to have the intention. They probably need intentionality more so than a community where it's 50% First Nation because it's
Yeah.
so obvious. Like I said earlier, we're dealing with a history here, a history of non-inclusiveness. And in order for us to be inclusive, we need to get past that. We need to be willing to say, this is what the composition of this school from an equity perspective needs to look like. And then we need to be very intentional about how we go about making that happen. Not with the intent of displacing people, but when new hires happen and you have a disproportionate amount of your staff that are not reflective of your or your makeup of your community or the makeup of the geography of your board, then you need to at that point be intentional in your hiring. You need to be intentional in your and themselves reflected in the school system that they're attending.
Yes, exactly. And I guess, as you say, and as we've learned, history sort of shown that without that intentionality, this really doesn't happen very much, if at all, on its own, accidentally, so to speak. And so that directionality, that mindful approach, really is essential. So just I could listen to you for much longer than we have, Darren. So maybe just if we could just with those children at the heart of the system and at the heart of the classroom in mind. And just thinking again of the many members, the many school trustees here that will be listening to our conversation, and then looking ahead after this, hopefully once in a century year that we're just hopefully finishing up and moving in stronger into 2021. What are your hopes? What are your wishes? What's your advice, your parting thoughts and wisdom, on this topic of representation for all those school board members as they continue their thinking and their action going into next year for their school divisions?
Well, my hopes are always that we form school boards across this country and we give Aboriginal voice a place in every school board. That we have members that are knowledgeable and capable and willing to go into their communities, to listen to the people in those communities, and to bring their voice to a place where their voice has not been heard. That being said, I think that one of the greater challenges moving forward in the next century is going to be creating an entire generation or two generations of First Nations high school graduates. I think if we go with that idea that we're not less, we're not inferior, we have the same ability, we have the same understanding, we have the same strength of thought, then we can do anything we want. I don't think it's impossible for us to have full graduation for the next 2 generations. And I think that in our communities where poverty is oftentimes a barrier, we know that the single biggest weapon against poverty is knowledge. And in this day and age, knowledge comes through education, so that we can create 2 generations of Aboriginal graduates in our communities. We will break the cycles of poverty that have plagued our communities for far too long.
Perfect. Well, Darren, just on behalf of the Manitoba School Boards Association and all of us here in your sister province of Manitoba, just want to thank you for your own voice, for the many voices you've listened to in your work in Nova Scotia and across the country at all levels, from teaching math to those high school students to leading whole systems. I feel hopeful just listening to your parting advice and see those possibilities. And I think just thank you again for your time today, and hopefully we can continue these conversations many more times after today.
Yes, I hope so too. I wish there were still no school boards in Nova Scotia. And unfortunately, now that they are no longer there, we've had to rely on other mechanisms to have our voices at the forefront for our superintendents and for our departments of education here. With that, I thank you.
Thank you so much. And if I may add, what you just mentioned is so important here, because just prior to the pandemic taking hold of the world, there was movement afoot in Manitoba's education system to look at all structures, great and small, with a lot of attention in some quarters to what other provinces had been doing or had done, including your own province there. Yeah, and so those experiences that you shared, despite those structural legislative differences here, may very well be tapped further if those directions take hold here in the future as well. So it's all been gold and wisdom that you shared today, Darren. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.